special meeting of the Goochland County Board of Supervisors for Thursday, March 26, 2020. So the first order of business is the chair comments, and I do have a few. So first of all, good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to all of our residents who may be joining us online. So we appreciate your participation in that way. But before I continue with comments, I would like to begin this meeting with a prayer, and I've asked Neil Spoonhour if he would lead us in a prayer, please.
Thank you. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we just thank you for this day, God. We thank you for the ability to assemble, albeit differently than we had anticipated. Lord, just give us wisdom as you have put us in positions of leadership, Lord, but let us listen with open ears and lead with the courage that we need. God, we just pray for all of the first responders, the healthcare workers, and those that have to be around people, God, that you would help this virus to subside quickly, Lord, so that we can go about our normal life, which we thank you for those freedoms that we have. And we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
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 Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Spoonhour. So, please take notice that we are convening this special meeting today with the board members participating via telephone conference call. And as permitted, pursuant to Virginia Code 2.2-3708G, because public health officials have advised that the current public health pandemic together, people together in one physical location, and because the purpose of the meeting is to address the current declared local emergency. So having said that, I'd like to thank all the staff, employees, all of our hard workers for everything they're doing to keep the Goochland County government functioning during this pandemic time. Next, I'd like to say that we are going to be discussing and potentially approving some emergency plans today. And I'd like to say that the ones that we are considering are intended to be temporary. The next issue is that everyone is aware that Mr. Badesky will be leaving us soon. And I wanted to assure our citizens and our staff that the board is fully engaged in finding a replacement, and we will begin doing that just as quickly as we possibly can. And the last item is that we will be testing some new technology today, and therefore I'm going to ask the public who are online to have an opportunity to provide some public comment at the end of the session. So we're testing this, and hopefully you will give us a little grace period if we have a few glitches. So thank you very much. We go to the new business. All three items will be presented by Ms. Tara McGee. The first is a resolution confirming the declaration of a local emergency. Ms. McGee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As the board is well aware, and the citizens, on March 13 at a regional meeting, our County Administrator, John Badesky, acting in his role as Director of Emergency Management, together with our board chairperson, Susan Lescalette, issued a declaration of emergency due to the potential public health threat from the spread of the COVID-19 virus. That declaration of emergency, which provides the board and the county more flexibility to adopt measures to protect the health, safety, and welfare of our residents, needs to be confirmed by the board. And that is what's before you today in the agenda item, asking you to confirm the declaration of emergency that was adopted on March 13. I will remind the board members that any declaration of emergency can be ended by you at any appropriate time in the future that you find that the emergency is no longer in effect in Goochland County. So it's an action today that we ask that you confirm the action taken on March 13th, and it is an action that will remain in effect for as long as the board thinks it needs to, based on the public health conditions.
Okay, thank you, Ms. McGee. Board, any questions or comments regarding, this resolution?
John Lumpkins here.
Yes, so I'm good.
Ms. McGee, can you, if possible, to give us just a short summary, are there any direct financial consequences to the affirming or not affirming the adoption of the emergency?
Any direct financial consequences is your inquiry? The state,
Yes, like I think, certainly in the federal system, you hear of like declaring emergency to free up some money, or, for different things. Is there, at our local level, is there any similar consequence by declaring or keeping the declaration of emergency in existence? Does that keep open resources for the county that would not be there without the declaration of emergency?
the state law speaks in terms of the opportunity to handle such things as procurement or other procedures without going through quite as lengthy a process. It also allows the county administrator and the county to incur costs or sign contracts to assist with any type of emergency action that's needed. Greater authority to do those things than it would otherwise. Mr. Badesky, in the past, when we've declared a state of emergency, does it have an impact on our ability to receive aid?
It does, Ms. McGee. That in particular, Mr. Lumpkins, to your question, if the board would not affirm this and continue this declaration, we would not be eligible for federal reimbursement should it become available. And in fact, we've started to track, with the assistance of Fire and Rescue, all the hours and expenditures related to this, backdating them to the 13th date when the emergency was declared. So without that declaration in place, we would also not be eligible for potential reimbursement in the future.
Thank you. That's what I was wondering. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, anyone else have a question or a comment about this?
Madam Chair, this is Neil Spoonhour. Ms. McGee, is there an easy way to kind of say what this does or doesn't trigger? So I know we're going to be talking about another ordinance today that we're going to be potentially adopting, and that would impact that ordinance, the 3571. But are there other things that this triggers that the board should be aware of?
I'll refer back to Mr. Badesky's response with respect to the opportunity to be eligible for federal reimbursement if it becomes available. This would also permit, without the adoption of something like the continuity ordinance, again, the ability to incur costs or enter into contracts and relax procurement and some other rules, all as directly relate to responding to the emergency. Those things are inherent in the state law for the declaration of a local emergency. And then, again, let me ask Mr. Badesky to weigh in on anything beyond what's written in the law, just based on other states of emergencies that we've declared and powers he's found.
I believe we've now stated everything to my basic understanding of how this operates. Chief Ferguson's in the room. He's also confirming that what we've shared is consistent with what this does trigger.
Mr. Spoonhour, did that answer your question?
I think so, but just for clarification. So this, by doing this, this doesn't say, okay, well, because we've declared a state of emergency, now these other things are put on the table that this board isn't aware of.
Mr. Spoonhour, I can assure you there's not a particular action that I'm taking on behalf of this county or the board that I'm not running by the board in some fashion. So if there is a particular concern, I'm certainly glad procedurally to address that with the board.
Okay, yeah, I just didn't, again, not that was my necessary concern, it just wanted to understand from okay, we declared a state of emergency, now because of that, it things can get triggered. I've been in other organizations where by doing one thing, it opens up a couple of different things down the line that may not be there during typical, when things are business as usual. I just wanted to make sure that really wasn't the case here, or if there was, that we were just aware of that. So thank you.
Mr. Spoonhour, to that, I'll simply say that the state law that allows us to consider the continuity of government ordinance, which is also before you this afternoon, does not, by its terms, I'm not sure that it requires that you adopt a state of emergency. It does provide the opportunity to adopt an ordinance for the continuity of government because of a disaster that has occurred. And this state of emergency, in the language before you, addresses the current situation as a disaster, as it is defined in state law. So it is also possible that we would not have the authority to adopt the continuity ordinance before you if we're not also declaring that the situation we're currently in qualifies under state law as a disaster.
Okay, thank you. Just one more follow-up. How does this, what is it triggers us to move to a state of non-emergency?
The board takes
Or is there something?
Yep, the board takes action to declare that the emergency has ended. Mr. Badesky, in the past, have you taken that action as the Director of Emergency Management and then had the board confirm it?
Yes, Ms. McGee, that's been more accurately the case. So if we didn't have to wait till a called board meeting and such, should that emergency be done between times. So very similar to how the initial one was enacted, it could be declared over and then certified by the board at an upcoming meeting.
Perfect, thank you very much. That's all, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Lumpkin?
Madam Chair, John Lumpkins, yeah, I move that the Board of Supervisors adopt a resolution confirming the declaration of a local emergency and that we adopt the resolution as presented in the agenda packet today.
Second, Ken Peterson.
All right, so we have a motion and second. Mr. Badesky, roll call, please.
Mr. Peterson?
Yes.
Mr. Lumpkins?
Yes.
Mr. Sharp?
Yes.
Mr. Spoonhour?
Yes.
Ms. Lachelette?
Yes. Okay, all right, so the resolution, has been confirmed of the local emergency. The next item is the emergency ordinance to allow for, continuity of government operations during this pandemic. Again, Ms. McGee.
Members of the board, Mr. Badesky, as I referenced in my previous answer as we discussed the emergency declaration, there is authority under state law for local governments, local governing bodies specifically, to adopt an ordinance which in essence relaxes or varies ordinances or state law requirements necessary in order to have the government continue to have what they call a continuity of government operations during and after a disaster situation. And please, I'm being lawyerly on you. Disaster is the word used in the state law, but it covers what we're talking about here in terms of this emergency. I have prepared for your consideration today the continuity of government ordinance and chose to cover several sections, several different actions. The first, in section number 2, is to be able to alter how this board and other bodies that the board that conduct actions on behalf of Goochland County. Sorry, there's an echo in the room, so I'm being a little distracted. My apologies. This board and other boards to be able to allow the public to continue to have public meetings as necessary and public hearings without necessarily gathering public in the room or without necessarily being present in the room. It provides for the cancellation of meetings. It provides every opportunity to be transparent and seek interaction from your public as is reasonably available in this electronic age. Most importantly, I think for Goochland, this Zoom function that we're using today allows anyone with a telephone to be able to dial in and listen to the meeting so that your meetings would still be held accessible to anyone with a telephone, does not require broadband or a computer, though those options through the live streaming are available as well. It also allows comments to be received by this board, particularly as we come up on our very important budget adoption, to receive comments electronically, by email before the meeting, just by voicemail, before, during, after the meeting. All of those are being available. And we're adopting it because, I'm asking you to adopt it because there isn't any right just generally under the emergency to have a meeting such as today's with you all participating electronically and the public electronically unless you adopt something like this for the continuity of government. In addition to the public meeting section, I then codified something that we have already been doing to protect the health, safety, and welfare of our citizens and employees, which is making reasonable changes to the hours or access to county facilities, real property, and even events that County Administrator John Badesky's been doing, again, solely in the interest of keeping people safe and healthy, whether it's the employees here or the public. Of course, we're making every effort, again, to have ways that the public can make appointments to come see us, drop off papers that they need to file, to continue to do the business of the government, but to do so without gathering a lot of people or having a lot of traffic through our facilities. In Section 4 of the proposed ordinance, the first paragraphs A and B simply codify that same authority that the Director of Emergency, that the county has whenever an emergency declaration is in place. Those two simply track the state law that says here's what you can do when there is a state of emergency. Paragraph C is of a more practical nature because there are any number of things that perhaps we should change our operations or change what's going on because of this emergency, but they are more limited in nature and temporary. For instance, there was a request to have the adoption fees waived from animal control so that they could try and get those animals placed without having people come into the building to make it easier for the animals to be placed. There's also discussion to cancel the rabies clinic that the board had already approved. Concern about businesses being able perhaps to put up more temporary signs or temporary signs for longer because they're open, they're trying to reach their customers. Those types of things are intended to fall within that temporary action paragraph in paragraph C. And they're designed so that Mr. Badesky, on behalf of the county, can take those actions, but then he would also report them to the board at the next regular meeting of the board. His actions would only be viable until the next regular meeting of the board, but then the board would have the opportunity to, retain or extend the effectiveness of any of Mr. Badesky's actions so that the county citizens would be aware of what actions are being taken for their benefit and during this situation. The authority I put into paragraph 4C is very similar to authority that we recently reviewed in another regional localities ordinance where they did something similar. Finally, Section 5 of this ordinance simply says that while we are all making every effort to continue county business as normal, to meet deadlines, to do reviews and so forth, in the unlikely event that we unfortunately are either struck ill in such a way that we are unable to do all those functions in a timely manner, that it will not be waiver, suspension, default against the county or the public bodies that are doing the county's business during that time frame. And so with the thought that this locality values so highly, both continuing to operate in the situation that we find ourselves in, continuing to respond to our citizens, while also protecting the health, safety, and welfare of your employees and residents, I have prepared the continuity ordinance for your consideration. And then if you have any questions about it, I would just ask if I have one more opportunity to describe for you that while this ordinance is in effect for 60 days, or can be in effect for 60 days, it is an emergency ordinance, which means it's being adopted without the public advertising that normally accompanies, and that type of advertising does need to occur within that 60 days, and there is a board decision to be made there. So we can have that discussion after we take any questions or comments about the ordinance generally. Madam Chair? We certainly appreciate your patience as we're working through this technology.
Ms. Lascolette?
Is there any other board member who is hearing us and can respond? Suddenly, I'm picturing them all five at home, calling out to us and wondering why we're not responding.
Do any board members hear us? Sure thing, we can hear you and we can hear the other board members, but you can't hear us.
Okay, well, we will work on that.
Right.
Here,
That-
here's Ms. Lashlett.
Thank you for your patience,
Mr.
board members.
Right. Well, we can hear you really well. You say you can hear us. I'm not sure exactly what's going on.
I don't think they
but,
can.
I think we've corrected.
We've now heard from Ms. Lascolette and Mr. Spoonhauer.
Okay, you can hear us now?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, good. Okay,
Okay, great.
so,
Um,
all right, so Mrs. Spoonhouse.
They're also hearing the
yeah, so, Ms. McGee, I was just curious from, so first off, thank you for putting this together. I know this has been a lot to think about and work on, so thank you for that. For the public comments, to make this feel like, is procedurally, will we be reading those in lieu of our typical public comment period? I see that there's the ability for comments and voicemails to be entered, but, and be part of what we're calling the public body members, but how does that actually play out during the meeting?
It will depend upon which methods the board picks. At the moment, staff is of the impression that the board is going to choose to have all of them apply to their April 7th public hearing. So the agenda already has, for instance, the telephone number here, the correct one to call into and participate in that way. However, we're already, the front of the agenda also will have the email address, and it will let the citizens know that if they email us anytime, both before and until April 13th, those comments will be provided to each board member. If voicemails are left on the dedicated voicemail line, those will be provided to the board member. We haven't had a specific discussion. I don't know if there'll be a summary of them provided. That's my impression, because those voicemails would also need to be summarized for the minutes. And then via the Zoom, for someone who's making a comment during the meeting, you should be able to hear those comments during the meeting in the way that you're hearing from each other at this time. Because your budget public hearing occurs and then no vote immediately follows, that is one public hearing that you have the opportunity to keep allowing voicemail and emails to occur after the public meeting closes, after the, public hearing, the meeting is over. And we're recommending that you do that for the budget public hearing, really for two reasons. One, because again, this is a new and evolving situation. You want to have as much, hear from your citizens as much as possible. Two, in the unlikely event that the technology doesn't work someone perhaps thought they could be on the phone and make a comment, and then the hearing closes, and for some reason they were unable to, they would still have the opportunity to send in that email or call and leave a voicemail. You're required to have your public hearing, by state law, you're required to have a public hearing on your budget at least 1 week before your vote. Your vote on the budget is scheduled for April 21st. So by allowing email and voicemail to continue through April 13th, all of those comments can be compiled and provided to you at least 1 week before a vote on your budget. So that is our recommendation for the April 7th budget public hearing.
Okay, so just follow up, please. So there are comments regarding actions we're taking today that I see on with the website next to the agenda items. Should we be going into those as individual board members, or will there be a time for us to review those as they are comments that are I believe, intended to influence our decisions?
You are.
Today's meeting.
If you are not hosting a public hearing during today's meeting, I don't know if the comments that are there are directed at anything on today's agenda. I'm not sure what you're seeing there, but today, while you may choose to allow public comment later in the meeting, you're not actually having a public hearing, so there's no public comment on the items before you today.
Okay, thank you.
Madam Chair?
Yes, Mr. Peterson.
Yes, thank you. Ms. McGee, I just had a couple of questions real quick. Under Section 1, we define public bodies pretty broadly to include things like the school board. Has this proposed emergency ordinance been reviewed and passed around with all the parties of interest, including the school board? And then the second part of that question is how this might affect the constitutional officer.
To the first part of your question, I let Superintendent Raley know that we were working on a continuity ordinance and that we intended to include the school board, and he advised me that Facebook Live was what they were thinking they might be using. So I specifically included social media platforms as a way to publicize and take comment, even though I didn't think county government was necessarily thinking of using that. I did not have time to publicize this ordinance to the other bodies. My thought was that since it has to be readopted, that if it met with the board's approval today, I would then transmit it to the other bodies that it would encompass, and to the extent they had concerns that then needed to be addressed, that could be done as we brought it back before you.
Okay. Okay, just wanted to make sure that we weren't unfairly restricting their ability to get things done, or if they had other ideas. But it sounds like we approve this now. Between now and our next meeting, you'll collect comment and input, and if there are any problems, we can address them at that point.
That was my thought, yes. The second part of your question was about constitutional officers. Again, I had not discussed this with them as of this time, simply because there hasn't been much time since it has been completed to do so. I have not yet researched whether we're entitled to encompass them within it, but again, when I have considered what do we need in order to make sure that government continues to operate in Goochland County, it may well be broad enough to encompass the constitutional officers. So if I discuss it with them and they are interested in being under its ambit, I would certainly bring that back before the board. I am not aware of similar right that the constitutional officers or any other body has to adopt this type of ordinance. In fact, amongst my colleagues, it's very clear, school boards do not have the right to adopt this type of ordinance themselves or these types of procedures. So without the assistance from this body, they would be under FOIA and some other things that may be difficult for them to meet during this situation. I did make it as broad as I could, sticking to within certainly what the Board of Supervisors, again, including boards that you only make the recommendations of appointment to, which includes the Board of Equalization and the Board of Zoning Appeals. But I would certainly speak to the constitutional officers about whether or not they chose to be under the ambit of this ordinance.
Okay, and so it sounds like it's not something the schools could do on their own, so this is important for us to do it on their behalf. It sounds like it also, the way it's defined, includes all county employees, but whether or not it includes constitutional officers and separately elected individuals is a matter of state law, whether we can do that or not, or whether they want to do it voluntarily or not to come under the same ordinance. Okay, this is an emergency ordinance enabled by the emergency declaration. If the emergency declaration is lifted, does this automatically sunset?
It is not drafted to automatically sunset. Two things. One, it's an emergency ordinance in part because it's being adopted without public notice. In addition, it's an emergency ordinance because it's an ordinance being adopted to maintain government continuity during this emergency. So there's two pieces there to why it's an emergency. It could have a sunset provision at the end of it that says, should the declaration be withdrawn or terminated, then this ordinance would also terminate. It also, by law, has only a 60-day life unless it is readopted. The way it is, and readopted after public notice. So the way we've put it together for the board today is your May 5th meeting, we would want to consider at least advertising this ordinance for readoption on that date. Then by May 5th, if there's no need for this to continue, you simply would not readopt it. Or you could adopt it with an effective date that says it ends when the declaration ends. There are any numbers of things that actions you could still take at that time. But we just wanted to make sure that we had authority from the board to advertise it, since that is a, total of an almost 3-week process to get it may only be a 1-week process for this type of ordinance.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Peterson. Any other comments or questions? Okay, hearing none, I do have one. Just for the record, would you tell us who the Director of Emergency Management is, what position that is?
I will. Our wonderful County Administrator, John Badesky, serves as your Director of Emergency Management, and normally that's how I would have drafted this, but not a little bit more. John added a little bit more uncertainty to that position yesterday. So instead of including both of his titles, in case at some point in time those duties are split in the short term, I went ahead and left it. This is to just say the Director of Emergency Management. That is held by County Administrator John Badesky.
Right. Thank you very much. I just want that to be on the record. That's all. Because I don't think it actually says that in the ordinance. Okay. Any other questions or comments? Okay. If there are none, do we have a motion?
Madam Chair, if I may speak to one other item that's in the agenda item, but unfortunately didn't get put into that board requested action section. Staff is seeking permission to advertise this ordinance for readoption at the board's May 5th regular meeting. Again, though stating that we may not even still need this ordinance by then. I did want the board to know that this ordinance by law does not require a public hearing on it. However, you are entitled to hold a public hearing on it. You typically hold a public hearing on ordinance amendments. So I would just like to have the staff to have guidance from the board as to whether to advertise a public hearing on this for May 5th or simply advertise the ordinance for readoption. And that can be taken up with a motion on the ordinance or separately.
Okay. So we could do it either way, but if we include a motion on the ordinance and also include to advertise that for our May 5th meeting, if that's the board's desire, or if that's the motioner's desire, maybe just do it as one motion might work.
Yes.
Okay. So, do we have a motion?
Madam Chair, this is Don Sharp. I would move that we adopt the emergency ordinance to allow for the continuity of government operations. ID is number 3571. And, I would include the option to, make the, notice for the extension should it become necessary.
Mr. Sharp, if I may, is that to advertise for a public hearing, to invite public comment, or simply to readopt?
To readopt.
Okay, so Mr. Sharp, you're moving to, adopt the ordinance and also to readopt at, I'm not sure you said, at our May 5th meeting without a public hearing, is that right?
Yes.
But to advertise to readopt, not to readopt.
That's correct.
Okay,
We would
advertise.
advertise, but not require a public hearing.
Right.
Okay, so, move to advertise, but not provide a public hearing, okay? So that's the motion. Do we have a second?
Madam Chair, this is Neil Spoonhour. I'll second for the sake of discussion.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Spoonhour. So, further discussion? I would like to make a comment. I think I would prefer to have a public hearing, just because that's generally been our practice, to have public hearings on ordinances, even though we're not required to. That would be my preference. But
I seem to, Madam Chair, this is Neil Spoonhour, I seem to, I concur with that. I kind of feel like if we're still in this position where we would even be considering moving forward with, say, restrictions or whatever we put in place, that I feel like it's going to be important to hear from the citizens.
okay, anyone else have a comment about the motion at all?
Yep. Madam Chair, Ken Peterson. You know, typically when we're doing things for the first time, we try to elicit or solicit as much public input as possible. If it's the 5th or 6th or 7th time down the same road, and we kind of know where the citizens are, then we maybe throttle back on that a little bit. But in this case, since we're, building the road as we're walking it and we're inventing things as we go, maybe we lean in the direction of more citizen input than less. That'd just be my comment.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Peterson. Anyone else have a comment? Okay, then, I'm sorry?
May I amend my motion then?
Mr.
Vote on it and then.
Mr. Sharp, if you'd like to propose an amendment to your motion, if Mr. Spoonhour, who seconded it, agrees to that amendment, then the motion could come forward as the motion to amend the motion would come forward. So, yes, if you would like to propose amendment.
Friendly amendment.
I I would propose that we adopt the ordinance as written and, announce, prior to extension to include public comment.
I accept that amended motion.
So then we would be advertising for our, just so I'm clear that I'm following everything. So we would be advertising for our May 5th meeting, a review of this ordinance, with public comment.
Public hearing.
Is that, I'm sorry, public hearing. I keep saying that, don't I? Public hearing, yes. I already wrote it down, didn't say it right. So public hearing. Am I saying that correctly?
That is the motion that's been made, and it's been agreed to by Mr. Spoonhour, the person who seconded the original motion.
Okay. Okay, good. Is there any other comment at this point? Question? Okay, Mr. Badesky, roll call, please.
Mr. Sharp,
Yes.
Mr. Spoonhour,
Yes.
Mr. Lumpkins,
Yes.
Mr. Peterson,
Yes.
Ms. Lachelette.
Yes. Okay. So, the emergency ordinance to allow for the continuity of government, been done. Okay, so the last new business item we have is an emergency ordinance regarding the Bridgewater Road Service District. So again, Ms. McGee.
Members of the board, you already have been made aware that the Bridgewater Roads Service District that you created, the roads have not been able to be completed and accepted by VDOT, though the county has had a great deal of work performed on them. They have simply not yet met VDOT standards, which apparently keep changing. In any event, this is before you today as an emergency ordinance for two reasons. One is we were looking to move this off our regular agenda because of so much else that's going on, the dealings with the emergencies and so forth. But the tax bills are prepared and mailed by the end of April. And while we didn't have time to reach out to the citizens and let them know everything we were thinking about doing to improve that ordinance, because if you remember, we also have proposed and would again propose in the future an easier payment mechanism for citizens, it was important that we go ahead and make sure that we change the accrual date on the service district from this year to next year, because it was the board's interest to not tax the citizens on the road when it hasn't been completed and accepted by VDOT as of yet. And so we ended up bringing this for you today on an emergency basis, so that we then can do the full public advertising, and this will be subject to a public hearing at your May 5th meeting. So the request before the board is first to adopt this emergency ordinance, which does no more than change the accrual of that tax from this year to next year, and also to schedule a public hearing at the board's May 5th meeting to readopt this ordinance so that the tax bills can be prepared without this tax being included for any member of the Bridgewater Service District.
Okay. So, Ms. McGee, this is Susan. So, if this were to be adopted today, then we'd be changing from January 1, 2020 to January 1, 2021, when we will begin assessing the tax. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Or is that decision not being made in May? It's being made today?
Yes.
Because May 5th would probably be late for the treasurer to get their tax bills out, right?
Yes, by your taking that action today, it is in effect so that they don't have to prepare the tax bills. And then when you readopt, if it is the board's action to do that on May 5th, that will allow everyone to know that will continue as a permanent ordinance change.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Thank you, Ms. McGee. Any, board questions or comments, regarding this ordinance?
Just, this may sound silly, but the road work still hasn't been completed, correct?
That's correct, sir.
Mr. Spoonhour, did you have any other questions?
No, Madam Chair.
Okay. Thank you. Any other board members with a question about, this ordinance?
Chair John Lumpkins, I'll go ahead and move that we adopt the emergency ordinance to amend Houston County Code Section 13-285, Bridgewater Road Service District, to delay the imposition of the service district tax from 2020 to 2021.
Set a public
We have a
hearing.
motion, do we have it? Yes, and set the public hearing, right?
Correct. Let me read through.
Under the board action requested, it refers to also setting the public hearing for May 5th to consider readoption of this
Okay,
emergency ordinance.
I was looking for that on here, and I'm not seeing it, but yeah, there it is. Yes, my motion includes scheduling for the May 5th, 2020 public hearing for readoption of this ordinance after public notice. Thank you.
Okay. So we have a motion, did we get a second?
I second.
Oh, you did second, okay. Thank you, Mr. Sharp. Okay, so we have a motion and a second. Do we have any other comments or questions?
Sorry, I feel like I'm reading the problem child today. So, just a clarification, if the ordinance is taking effect, what's the purpose of the public hearing? That we can rescind it, and then we would send out new tax bills that would have the proper amount, if that's what we desired?
It may not seem practical, but the purpose of the public hearing is because this will not continue to remain in effect unless it is readopted with public notice. So we're required to to provide the public notice. And then in this situation, because it's a service district, you're also required to have a public hearing. Obviously, should the unlikely circumstance occur and this not get readopted, then yes, the tax will have been imposed and tax bills would have to go out. That being said, we're putting the scheduled readoption as soon as we can, reasonably can, so that everyone understands that's not what will occur.
I'm sorry, can somebody, Ms. McGee's mic, I think, is a little hard to hear sometimes, but I guess I'm not understanding. If we're adopting it today, we're saying, okay, we're adopting it, that we're not gonna impose the tax until January, then we're coming back on May, in our meeting in May, with a public hearing on something that we've already adopted. Is that just so that we have any ability to change what we've done today?
It is because today's action is without public notice. And so while you're allowed to adopt and make something immediately effective, you have to choose to readopt after public notice in order for it to remain in effect. And that's not specific to tax bills or anything.
Is that, okay.
Madam Chair, this is Ken Peterson. Let me take a cut at this if I can. And correct me if I'm get off base on any of this. We're adopting this as, it says, an emergency ordinance. To me, that implies it remains in effect as long as we're in an emergency situation, and it can also, in an emergency situation, can be done without a public hearing. But that at some point, the emergency is going to be lifted, and that this would, when we turn to normal course of business, it does require a public hearing for it to remain in effect. Is that even close?
It is very close. The only difference is you actually do not have to be in a state of emergency to adopt an emergency ordinance. An emergency ordinance is allowed under state law, and it just says you can adopt an emergency ordinance effective immediately, but it has to be readopted upon public notice in the future, within 60 days.
So this really is not tied to our declaration of an emergency, nor is it tied to the emergency ordinance that we just approved?
That's correct.
It's tied to the timetable the treasurer is under to get the tax bills out. May
That's,
5th is too late for her to get the tax bills out and on time.
that's
Yes,
correct.
and that we have the authority to do this separate and apart from everything else we've done today as an emergency ordinance. That's provided for under state law currently. And is that correct, Ms. McGee?
That is correct.
And just everything starts with emergency, you think that it's all tied together, but in this case, it's
Exactly.
standalone. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's different kind of emergency.
So I guess my question would be, what would we have done if we didn't have this hearing today?
We had planned to have a public hearing on this in any event, but it was getting carried along, and simply, we were doing it before taxes were due, but not realizing that we were acting after tax bills were usually prepared. So
I see. Okay, great. Thank you.
that's the difference.
So, we have a motion, and we have
You have
a
a second.
second. Do we have a second on this?
Mr. Sharp, I think that.
Sharp, Mr. Sharp, okay. Yes, thank you. Okay, if there are no other questions or comments, Mr. Podesky, roll call, please.
Mr. Spoonhour,
Yes.
Mr. Lumpkins,
Yes.
Mr. Peterson,
Yes.
Mr. Sharp,
Yes.
Ms. Lachelette.
Yes. Okay. All right, that is the three items of new business. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to John Podesky to give us just an operations update. If you'd like, Mr. Podesky.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chairman. I just did want to give a summary update on the county's response to COVID-19 and the actions that we've been taking. As the board's aware, we have been part of a regional effort in response to this. Our fire and rescue, public information officers, myself, and some other county staff have been engaged in monitoring this with our health officials really since, very actively since the day of the declaration. And several times a day at a minimum, we are continuing to get updates and discuss this and look at operational impacts. And I just want our citizens to know that we are working, even though our doors are currently closed to the public to minimize the transmission of COVID-19. We are still working very actively on behalf of our citizens. All of our processes are still in place on the local government side while they are being done through drop-off, phone call appointments, and pickup appointments. We are still conducting business on behalf of our citizens. We had originally announced that we anticipate that that would be in place till March 31st. Based on the health information that we continue to receive daily and as recent as this morning, we are proposing to continue the same operational practices we have in place until April 17th. Certainly, if we learn something new and we can lift any of those kinds of restrictions, we would do so well before that date. But as we plan with staffing and citizen communications, we are proposing to continue to do that through April 17th. During that time, we have other county business that will need to occur. As this board's aware, and as we discussed here a little bit earlier, we do have a public hearing on our budget on April 7th at 6 p.m. That will follow our 5 p.m. regular meeting, and that time has been changed. It normally would have started at 2. We are starting on the 7th with a 5 p.m. meeting, and then a 7 p.m., or excuse me, 6 p.m. public hearing on the budget. Those will be set up in a similar fashion as you have here today in Zoom meeting format. Preceding those meetings will also be an established Finance Committee meeting that will be set up through conference call as well. We're continuing to maintain our social distancing practices, and internally we continue to maintain the thorough practices of sanitization on a daily basis. And on a daily basis also, our public safety people are exercising additional measures to make sure that they're minimizing the potential exposure for themselves. Our 911 operators are taking extra diligence in screening calls before they're dispatching as part of their process and the EMD process. We continue to keep our convenience centers open, and I caveat that today. We are and we've been reaching out to the board to get some feedback. We're looking at measures on how we can continue to support our residents, and we'll put out additional guidance on convenience centers within the next week. Just ask our residents to be particularly attentive that if we continue to get large drop-offs and we're seeing a substantial amount of increase at our convenience centers due to let's say some folks are using their downtime to potentially clean out. It is putting an extra strain not only on the Goochland County convenience centers, but throughout the region and with our collection partners. We're trying to come up with ways that we can suggest to our residents on how to manage that as effectively. We're talking about some other ways to continue to allow those drop-offs, but also make sure we can take in the day-to-day trash that folks are generating just for their homes, not from the cleanup. So more guidance probably will come out as it relates to convenience centers next week, but just ask our residents to be patient and work with us as it relates to the convenience centers. Our parks and recreation facilities have remained open through all of this, outdoor facilities, and we look to continue to maintain those open for our public, our dog parks, our trails, our parks. Just ask the residents to please be attentive to the social distancing expectations of the CDC, put out by the CDC, supported by the health department, the governor, the president. We are seeing some folks, because they're outdoor, doing some activities that are putting themselves, pick up basketball games, football games and such, that they're not maintaining that social distance. We just ask people to please be aware of that and cautious. Even though it's outdoors, it's still a practice that is being recommended by all the health professionals. One of the things, because we're in unique times, we're going to try something a little unique ourselves. Dr. Raley and I are going to host a virtual budget town hall on Facebook Live next Tuesday, March 31st at 6 p.m. This will be the first time as a county we're using that technology as well, so I ask in advance for some patience. But we're going to try to do a virtual town hall. Facebook Lives allows for some interactivity for those that choose to watch, and they can post questions, and Dr. Raley and I are going to do our best to answer them. And that's next Tuesday, March 31st at 6 p.m. We'll give that a shot, and hopefully that's an additional way we can get information out. We will post the slides that we'll be referring to online for people to access independent of the Facebook Live, but they will be part, we're going to do our best to film that with them in the background, but it's going to be best to have those separately accessible. That's, before I go into a few other updates, I'm going to pause there for a second and answer any questions the board may have on our response. Just so you know, in the room also is Fire and Rescue Chief Eddie Ferguson, that has, I have to really say I'm very proud of him and his team and the leadership, and Sheriff Creasy, and really Dr. Raley and the efforts they are doing on behalf of the schools and our families and our community. We all talk daily, multiple times sometimes, and often on non-traditional hours, all in an effort to try to make sure we're taking care of the citizens. So if you have any questions for myself specifically related to this or for Chief Ferguson, we're glad to pause and answer those questions.
Any comments or questions at this point?
Good?
Madam Chair, Ken Peterson.
Yes.
Mr. Badesky, thank you for that update, and thank you, Eddie and the emergency folks for everything you do on the front lines. You mentioned this conference call is all about the COVID-19 and the impact on the county. You mentioned April 7th would be the public hearing on the budget. I assume this is the case, but will you be bringing to us estimated, forecasted, best guessed impacts of this COVID-19 on fourth quarter 2020 and the budget for FY 21 on April 7th? So potential impacts on revenues and expenses directly attributable to this for possible amendment or adjustments to our budget?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Peterson. We have been and will continue between now and April 7th pulling up to do our best to estimate and quantify that. Been meeting with the Commissioner of Revenue, the Treasurer, the Assessor, Barbara, Terry even joined us on that call, some of our economic development folks. We are doing our very best to help you with those projections. We may hit them as early as the Finance Committee on April 7th, and then as part of the budget presentations later on during the public hearings. I will tell you we are definitely anticipating a hit to next year's budget, and especially late third, fourth quarter of this year's budget. And so we are going to be proposing to address the budget in a different manner than we have in the past. And while we haven't fully amended the overall budget, we're definitely going to be talking to the board about withholding some appropriations. I've been in conversations with Dr. Raley. It's going to impact across the board the availability of the revenues and the offsetting expenditures. So yes, Mr. Peterson, simply to your question, we do hope to come on April 7th with some estimates of those impacts to both fourth quarter and for next year.
Okay, thank you for that, Mr. Badesky. Just let me just say up front that I understand there's very limited visibility into the future at this point. There's a lot of fog around the future, and so I'm not looking for a degree of precision here, but perhaps some measure of contingency planning or phasing in or ranges of outcomes depending, because it'll be driven, what we do will be driven by, in some part, by how things unfold going forward, which is, again, subject to some degree of variability at this point. So, but having said all that, I think we do need to develop some thoughts around this. So I'm encouraged to hear that you already have that in the works. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Anyone else have any comments at this point for Mr. Badesky? Okay. Hearing none. Mr. Badesky, do you have more that you wanted to add?
Madam Chairman, I just briefly will take the opportunity that today's not about me, but I did, as the board's aware, my resignation was made official yesterday. And as I've shared with individual board members and the leadership and the staff of the county, it's been a real honor to have been entrusted with this position, and thank the board for your support. I will be working up to the last minute here in late June and longer if needed, and look forward to assisting the board and the staff with the transition in any way I can. But there's a lot of hard work to do on behalf of our residents between now and then.
Well, thank you, Mr. Badesky. We fully expect that you will continue to work at the same fashion and pace that you have all along, so we thank you for that. Okay. So, at this point, I had mentioned in my comment that we wanted to try a public comment period. So, do we have, Ms. Kaywitz, do we have anyone on the line that might want to make a public comment, or they would have to dial in? Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am, we have one citizen on the phone, and I'm happy to unmute, and I will do that now.
Okay.
Hello, citizen? Hello?
Well, if they can hear you, then maybe it's possible they would rather just listen and not make a comment,
Perhaps.
perhaps. Okay, and that was the only person that was on the call?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, I wanted to at least give an opportunity if anyone did want to make a comment. So, unless there's any other business in front of the board, we will adjourn to the following, Tuesday, April 7th at, as Mr. Badesky said, 5 p.m. and 6 p.m. Now, the finance, committee meeting, Mr. Badesky, is that, at what time is that? 3?
1.
1 o'clock,
4.
ma'am.
Okay, so 4 o'clock, okay. But the board will meet at 5 p.m. and 6 p.m. for the, budget, public hearing. April 21st will be the adoption of the county and school budgets and capital improvement plans, tax rates. And May 5th will be our regular, meeting. At 1 o'clock, we will have the audit and finance committee meeting. And then our regular meeting will be at 2 p.m. and 6 p.m. So if there's no other business, then this meeting is adjourned. Thank you all very much for all your efforts. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.